On Tuesday, the 6th of June 1944, Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history of warfare, D-Day. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the Allied landings along the 50-mile stretch of beaches of Normandy marked the start of the long and costly campaign of men and materials to liberate northwest Europe from the Axis occupation. Now I'm here at the town of Aramash, and this beach we're on is the Gold Beach, where the British soldiers landed. And what I've got here behind me is what's left of the famous Mulberry Harbour, which was towed over from the UK during D-Day and then was assembled after everybody had landed on the beaches. Now again, there was a Mulberry Harbour on Omaha Beach, but it didn't last very long. It was actually destroyed in a storm where the British built theirs slightly better than the Americans, and it withheld during the storm. So you can't believe all this is still left on the beach. Amazing. Like all the beaches, Gold Beach was set up into sections, which was Howe, Item, Jig and King, which themselves were set up into sections of red and green. The objectives at Gold were to secure a beachhead, move west to capture Aramash and then establish contact with the American forces at Omaha, then capture Bayonne and then the small port at Port-en-Bessin, and to link up with the Canadian forces at Juno to the east. The ideas behind the Mulberries was to create two tide-free sheltered harbours for the delivery of all the war materials and the troops. This would eliminate the need to capture a pre-existing harbour like Dieppe. All the elements for the harbours would be prefabricated in the UK and towed across the English Channel after D-Day. A total of 40,000 workers were employed on this gigantic construction project, which required the opening of special building sites at ports throughout the UK. Tugs towed the caissons and sections of the concrete and steel pontoons, which would make up 7 miles of piers and jetties. Both harbours were almost fully functional when on the 19th of June a large northeast storm of force 6 to 8 blew into Normandy and devastated the Mulberry harbours at Omaha Beach. The harbours have been designed with summer weather conditions in mind, but this was the worst storm to hit Normandy coast in 40 years. The destruction at Omaha was so bad that the entire harbour was deemed irreparable. 21 of the 28 Phoenix caissons were completely destroyed. This is one of the kite anchors that civil engineer Alan Beckett designed for the Mulberry harbours. This was one of the things that the American engineers forgot to use, or used very little of, so it was one of the major contributions for the harbour breaking up during the storm. Mulberry was a code name for all the various different structures that would create the artificial harbours. There was the Gooseberry, which would metamorphosis into a fully fledged harbour. There were two harbours, Mulberry A for the Americans and Mulberry B for the British. The Mulberry harbours consisted of floating outer breakwaters called bombardants. A static breakwater consisted of corncobs and reinforced concrete caissons called Phoenix breakwaters. Floating piers are roadways codenamed Whales and Beetles, and pier heads codenamed Spuds. These harbours, when built, were both a similar size to Dover Harbour in the UK. The Phoenixes were 146 concrete caissons, which were 60 metres long, 18 metres high and 15 metres wide, making up 9.5 kilometres of the breakwater. They were airtight floating cases, open at the bottom with air cocks to lower them to the seabed in a controlled fashion. Around 2 million tonnes of steel and concrete were used in their construction. Most of the concrete caissons were manufactured on the River Thames or the River Clyde, and in some cases using hastily constructed dry docks. Bombardants were floating breakwaters comprising of huge metal crucifix-shaped structures ballasted and firmly anchored in place. They were the outermost barrier and therefore the first line of defence against the rough seas of the English Channel. The Gooseberries were 70 obsolete merchant vessels or blocking ships. They were gathered together at Oban on the west coast of Scotland. They were stripped down, ballasted and primed with explosive scuttling charges. The vessels sailed under their own steam and were sunk in 5 locations, including the 2 at the Mulberry harbours. The pier heads were located at the seaward end of the roadways. Each stood on 4 legs called spuds, with the platform that could be raised and lowered with the tide, using electric winches. 23 were planned, of which 8 were spares. This metal structure was a component of the floating roadway which connected the unloading piers to the shore. It was designed by Alan Beckett and spanned 80 feet long and weighed 28 tons. The floating roadway rested on steel or concrete floats. We can still see these floats today on the beach. So these are the surviving beetles. They are concrete and steel floats or pontoons to support the roadways. Each were capable of supporting the 56 tons of the whales or the bridges and a 25-ton tank. The manufacturing process was enormous and was in danger of overstretching the capacity of the UK civil engineering industry. From late summer 1943 onwards, 300 firms were recruited from around the country, employing around 40,000 personnel at its peak. Men from trades and backgrounds not associated with construction industry were drafted in and given crash courses appropriate to the work they were carrying out. Their task was to construct 212 caissons, ranging from 1,672 tons to 6,044 tons, 23 pierheads and 10 miles of floating roadway. And as you can see, they were that well constructed, they still survive today. These steel beetles floats were assembled in Richborough, Kent, the concrete beetles in Southsea, Marchwood and Southampton. Now the beach behind me is Juno Beach, and this is where the Canadian 3rd Division landed on D-Day. This was also the bloodiest beach on D-Day. Now everybody thinks Omaha was. Well, technically more soldiers were killed on Omaha, but more soldiers landed on Omaha than there was on Juno Beach. Now about 80% of the 1st and 2nd wave soldiers coming onto the beach were killed here on Juno, which makes it about 1,200 soldiers they lost here on the first day. So comparing the number of soldiers what came onto the beach, massive amount of casualties and deaths here on Juno Beach. This bunker was part of Weiderstands Nest 28 and is on the seafront at Bugny-sur-Mer and contains several plaques to Canadian and British troops who landed here to liberate Normandy and France. They included the Queen's Own Rifles, 22nd Dragoons, the 5th Hackney Battalion, the Royal Berkshire Regiment No. 8 Beach Group, Stormont Dundas and Glengarry Highlanders. This bunker has now been turned into a monument for the Queen's Own Rifles, where 800 men came ashore on the 6th of June. They were the lead assault on this dramatic D-Day assault on this strong point. By the end of the day, the Queen's Own Rifles were the only unit to achieve their assigned D-Day objective. The cost of this objective was the loss of 143 riflemen who were killed or wounded. At the end of World War II, the Queen's Own Rifles had suffered over 1,000 battle casualties and 462 riflemen had made the supreme sacrifice. Now, looking down the beach from Weiderstands Nest 28, you can probably see the most famous French houses ever from D-Day. Now, if you've ever seen any old footage of D-Day, this is probably what you would have seen. These are Canadian soldiers coming ashore at Juno Beach, right in front of this house. And this is probably one of the most famous houses you've ever seen. This was the first French house liberated during D-Day. So this is what the house looked like after D-Day. This is what the house looks like today. Just down the beach from the bunker, still part of the Weiderstands Nest 28, is this Trebruck, which, if I was here at D-Day, I would feel very, very vulnerable being here with my MG42 machine gun, looking out on this beach with not much help. But these were the major reason for the loss of life. This is Weiderstands Nest 27 on Juno Beach at St. Aubin-sur-Mer. On D-Day, this stretch of the beach was the easternmost part of Juno, codenamed Narn Red. It was designated to the Canadian North Shore North Brunswick Regiment, which landed here with 2 companies at about 8:10 a.m. Widerstands Nest 27 was a German strongpoint on the beach with a 50mm pedestrian gun, which the Germans called a 5cm KWK. The casemate's design and positioning protected the gun from any direct fire from the sea, and it could cope with any attacks from the beach. The gun was responsible for knocking out 4 Sherman tanks before it was knocked out itself by another 3 tanks from the town. Here you can see the damage on the casemates that the tanks made when they did their frontal assault. This is a better preserved example of the gun, which I found right next to Pegasus Bridge. After this gun was captured, it was used by the British paratroopers to shoot at the Benneville Castle. After the gun had been put out of action, this became the first location for Allied tanks to enter France. This stretch of beach also has an unusual photograph of Juno. A P-47 Thunderbolt from the 365th Fighter Bomber Group, 386th Fighter Squadron, US Army Air Force, beached close to the sea wall on Juno Beach. The aircraft was flown by 2nd Lieutenant John Alfred Weiss, who crash-landed into the sea off St. Aubin-sur-Mer on the 10th of June 1944. Sadly, Weiss was killed in the crash. Again, if I overlay a picture from the crash and today, you can see exactly where it happened. On D-Day, 300 Martin B-26 Marauders struck the Cherbourg Peninsula at low level and on time. Out of 2,218 heavy Allied bombers, they were the only ones to hit their target. Their target was Widerstands Nest 5 on Utah Beach, only a couple of minutes prior to the troops landing on the beach. It was one of the final missions to take place on D-Day prior to the landings, flown by Major David Dewhurst, the experienced commander of the 553rd Bomber Squadron, US 8th Air Force. This was the final opportunity to neutralise the German defensive fortifications, therefore giving the troops a better chance of making it off their assigned landing beaches. The success of this mission and landing in the quieter Victor sector on the beach was the reason for the light casualties on Utah Beach. There was a total of 11,590 Allied aircraft deployed, including the B-17 and the Avro Lancaster. Allied planes dropped around 13,000 tons of bombs before the landings on D-Day, but they completely missed their target. There was a total of 832 Douglas C-47 transporter planes deployed, towing gliders and dropping paratroopers. Around 23,000 paratroopers and glider troops were used in the Normandy campaign. They were all landed inland behind the main lines of the German defences on the beaches. They were given jobs like taking the town of Saint-Mère-l'Église and securing key approaches to the Allied beachheads. In defence, the Germans had 815 aircraft available, including the Focke-Wulf F-190. The Germans also had about 40,000 troops defending the Atlantic Wall at Normandy. There were 6,939 Allied ships deployed, with 25,500 Allied sailors on board. There was over 200,000 beach obstacles installed by the German army. There was 1,550 assorted tanks, with 12,500 other vehicles. There was 132,000 Allied soldiers from 15 different nations landed on the beaches at D-Day, and an estimated 20,500 Allied and German soldiers lost their lives during the Normandy campaign.